All right, so we are going to be starting on chapter 16. I know it's a little bit of a jump, but we'll get back to the chapters 12 and so on. This just has a more smooth flow. So chapter 16 is about Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium, and it's related to the genetics we were talking about in our last chapter where we did Punnett squares. And so I just want to give you a heads up that chapter 16's summary and Learn Smart will be due not this coming Friday, but the next Friday. But obviously, the earlier you do it, the more you'll understand current topics that we're talking about. And then also, you won't have to worry about it on the deadline of next Friday. So keep that in mind if you just have any time in this week or in the weekend to just get it done early. So our learning objective will be that learners will be able to apply mathematical routines to determine Mendelian patterns of inheritance provided by data sets. So the lab that we will be doing or introducing later on this week is going to be a math-based model, and we're going to get to use a computer for it instead of a demo for it. And the reason we can do it is because Hardy-Weinberg follows certain rules, and they're math-based rules. It's simple though. Don't get too worried about it. So let's go through some terms, and then we'll talk about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium in general so that you have a basis of understanding to build your lab knowledge off of. So you can look these up so that you can actually see them, or you can just copy off the definitions from here. But the terms I want you to find definitions for are evolution, species, population, frequency, allele, microevolution, equilibrium, and adaptations. And there are two kinds of adaptations. So basically, you're going to want to look these up with their definition for biology. You don't want to just look up the general definition because some of these actually have normal English conversational definitions. You want to look up like evolution in biology or definition of evolution in biology. And if you need to, you can copy these down as well because these are the shorthand versions of them. A quick note is that adaptations, the two kinds are, there's behavior-based adaptations, and there's also physical-based adaptations. And usually when we talk about adaptations, we're talking about the physically based ones. And we know that for those ones, they don't occur with purpose or with conscience. They occur by chance or mutation in genetics. So the behavior-based adaptations are interesting to talk about, but they don't follow the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium because they are by choice of occurrence. Okay, so how do populations evolve? So microevolution is an evolutionary change within a population due to a change in allele frequencies. And so we talked about alleles, right? When we talked about the capital B, lowercase b. So in every population, there is a percentage of alleles for each type of allele for one gene. So for example, if you just wanted to focus on hair type alleles in wild boar, and you would look at one population that lived in the woods over to the east by any chance, and you'd be like, well, there's coarse and there's smooth hair, and those are the two alleles. And if you just collect population data, you'd be able to notice that, hey, 80% of them have coarse hair and 20% of them have smooth hair. And so you'd be able to kind of get an allele frequency out of that, right? Obviously, we also know that there's a dominance and a recessive, so then you wouldn't be able to get that just from observing them. But if you were able to genotype them, then you would actually know the exact allele ratios of how many of them have that capital C for coarse fur and how many of them have that lowercase c for smooth fur, right? Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium has conditions, and they're rarely always met. So in the lab that we're going to do, we're going to put it in ideal Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium conditions where all the conditions are always met. But in nature, they're not usually always met, and evolution doesn't occur super fast because of that. So deviations from a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium indicate that evolution has taken place. And so when we take this ideal model and apply it to real populations in real life, any changes from that or any differences from that indicate to us that evolution already took place. And it's kind of cool because then you can predict evolution as well. So analysis of allele changes in populations over time determines the extent to which evolution has occurred. So you can predict how many times evolution occurred. You can predict kind of the time span between evolution. Sorry, not evolution, but between bursts of evolution within populations. You can also kind of look back on data and predict at what point along in time that these evolution events occurred. And so there are the conditions on the left here. I'm going to ask that you do write them down in kind of column setups in a table setup, but you don't need to maybe draw the pictures as long as you have the idea understanding of what they are. So the first Hardy-Weinberg condition is that random mating must occur. So basically, males and females in a population of animals cannot have a preference. They have to just mate with whoever they come across. Okay, so the deviation from that condition would obviously be non-random mating. The deviation would be that mates have a preference for one specific type or one specific trait. The effect of the deviation on the population is that alleles do not sort randomly. Okay, in random mating, alleles will be going randomly, being spread to the next generation. But if there is a preference, then alleles do not sort randomly because certain alleles will be sought out as a preference over others. The expected deviation from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is going to be a change in genotype frequencies. In Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, there is no change in genotype frequencies. Okay, and here evolution will not have occurred. The next Hardy-Weinberg condition will be no selection. So that means the environment or nature is not causing one type or one allele or one physical trait to survive better than another. And obviously, the deviation from that condition is going to be selection. In this picture, you can see that when the birds are looking at these moths, one is easier to see than the other. So then obviously the bird is going to be able to catch the lighter colored ones easier and eat them more often, right? So the effect of deviation on population, or the effect of having selection, would be that certain alleles are selected for or against. Okay, so the expected deviation from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is that there's going to be a change in allele frequencies. Has evolution occurred? Yes. The Hardy-Weinberg condition that is no mutation has a deviation where obviously there are mutations occurring. And the reason why we say that it's really hard for all of these conditions to be met is because in an environment that we can control to some degree, we can control the mating and the selection, but you cannot really ever control the mutation because those will occur naturally and they occur as mistakes in cellular replication and gamete formation. And it's just something that it's like very hard to manipulate. So the deviation is mutations. And then the effect of deviation on population would be the addition of new alleles. So not only was it possible that certain alleles have higher survival chance, but also you can have new alleles made and introduced to the population just from mutating within the population. And so addition of new alleles will cause the change in allele frequencies, which is the expected deviation from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And yes, evolution has occurred in this case. The next Hardy-Weinberg condition that we're going to talk about is no migration. So if you're moving individuals between populations, you're already automatically changing the allele frequency. So if you don't allow for migration, then the allele frequencies stay the same within this population for this generation. And a deviation will be immigration or emigration, so entering or leaving. And then the effect of the deviation on population will be that individuals carry their alleles into or out of the population, right? We said before, this will change allele frequencies. This deviation will change allele frequencies and move you out of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So you're no longer in that equilibrium because your allele frequencies are changing. So has the evolution occurred? Yes. The last Hardy-Weinberg condition would be having a large population. So some populations might meet all of the above, but if the population isn't big enough, then it would have been a genetic drift situation, right? And that is a non-Hardy-Weinberg condition. So if your population is really large, then you wouldn't have any changes in allele frequencies because the vast size of the population maintains a certain kind of resistance to change. So the deviation from this condition would be having a small population where things can shift very dramatically, very easily, because one individual is already considered a large percentage of the allele ratio in that population, if there's a small population, right? So things that cause this are like the bottleneck effect or the founder's effect. And the bottleneck effect is basically when some kind of natural disaster event happens and kills a large part of the population, and only the leftover population is really small. That becomes the new allele frequency, and they are the ones that are repopulating. The founder effect is basically starting off with just a very small population, having them populate an area, maybe because they travel to a new area and they're going to be the foundation for this new larger population. But their genes can only be sourced from this small original population. So their allele frequencies are subject to a lot of change because they start off as a small population. And if individuals are killed or if they leave, then that is a huge effect on the allele frequency because the individuals originally already take up such a large percentage each individual at a time. So if there's only 5, each individual is 20% already. So the effect of this deviation of population is loss of allele diversity. So if you lose a large part of the population and you only have a small part left, then you might be losing some alleles entirely, or you might be dramatically shifting the original ratio of the alleles, right? And like I said, some alleles may completely disappear. So the expected deviation from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium will cause changes in allele frequencies. And yes, evolution has occurred or it will occur. As you notice that over here, we're changing genotype frequencies for random mating, and evolution does not occur with random mating, with non-random mating, but random mating does encourage that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium does maintain and stay. So all of the other ones do cause evolution. The change in genotype due to non-random mating doesn't technically cause evolution, but it can be related to. So the first cause of microevolution would be genetic mutations, because that's the raw material for evolution to take. Without mutation, you don't have different alleles. So you have to have mutations in order to have new alleles to begin with. Some mutations might be more adaptive than others, meaning that they might cause an individual to better fit in the environment or better survive in an environment. So for example, genetic mutations affecting pigment color and peppered moths have provided the variation needed for natural selection to occur. If all moths were the same color, then there would be no preference in who gets hunted down first. But if there are lighter colors and darker colors, whoever blends in better is not going to get eaten first, right? Whoever doesn't blend in is going to get eaten first. And that is the variation that causes a natural selection gradient. Gene flow is also called migration. So if you have gene flow from one population to another, you're bringing alleles from one population to another. And the original population that left is going to lose alleles. In this case, though, you can see for flowers, since they're not physically moving, their pollen is blowing around by the wind, and that's gene flow because the pollen is going from one population to another population. If it's carried by wind, it could go across oceans, it could go across islands, and it's going to bring a new allele over to the other population, because before, this population on the right never had any blue petals, but now it got introduced to some alleles from the population across on the left by way of wind, by way of pollinator. Genetic drift is changes in the allele frequencies of a population due to chance. So we talked about migration, and that's purposeful movement. That's not by chance. But genetic drift is caused by things like natural disasters, things that can't really be controlled. So it does not necessarily lead to adaptation to the environment. It could just be an expansion of the genes or the allele frequency that is left in the environment. So if that population just breeds and breeds and breeds and breeds, it could just expand that same, it could expand the population while maintaining the same allele frequency, but sometimes it can also be paired with environmental adaptation. So it occurs by disproportionate random sampling from populations. So it can cause the gene pools of two isolated populations to become dissimilar. Some alleles are lost and some become fixed or unopposed. So if there's a large majority, then usually that one will become the most common, or it might become the only phenotype or allele that is left in the population, especially if it is an advantageous one for survival. So what is likely to occur? When is it likely to occur? Well, after a bottleneck event, when severe inbreeding occurs, or when founders start a new population. And it all basically is talking about having a small allele pool to originally pull from and to try to expand a population off of. So there's a stronger effect in small populations for genetic drift. If the population is medium to large size, then you're closer to Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and there's not much issue with the allele frequencies shifting too much. So genetic drift is, again, the bottleneck or founder's effect creating a small population. Here's a figure of A, B, C, D going from this color ratio of alleles to this color ratio of alleles. And they give you the numbers as well. So you're going to explain this figure over here for a second. You're going to explain what are the effects of this example of a bottleneck or founder's effect, right? Take into consideration the number of alleles left in the beginning compared to the end, the ratio of alleles in the beginning to the end, and what happens kind of as the process goes through of time, right? These arrows just represent time going on. So explain the sentence, this figure in a few sentences, and I will be looking at those explanations. So natural selection is something that happens outside of any population's control. and it is a change in allele frequencies of the gene pool. Improved fitness of the population is something that occurs over time as natural selection causes a population to become better fit to an environment or to the current conditions of the environment. Obviously, the conditions can change. If the conditions can change all of a sudden, then obviously the current population that once was the best fit is no longer the best fit. And then the ones that are better at surviving are then going to go on and reproduce and pass down their genes that cause them to be better surviving. And then slowly the population will again shift towards being a good fit to the new conditions. So again, basically surviving and reproducing or having more offspring equals higher fitness. So the more you're able to pass down your genes, the better or higher fitness you have. And those that usually survive better are the ones that are having higher fitness, right? Because then they have the opportunity to mate and have babies. So this is a major cause of microevolution. The other one is genetic drift, like we just said, right, on a smaller scale. And so natural selection can cause the stabilizing of a population where the peak narrows. So this is the spectrum of a population, right? You might have some on one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. And this could be anything from running speeds, from slow to fast, or it could be colors that help blend in with camouflage from light to dark, right? If there is a specific selection that stabilizes the population, it's going to select for that medium phenotype or the medium presenting characteristic, then it's going to cause that peak to narrow, because often more times than not, the ones that have that medium characteristic survive better, and therefore they pass on their genes, and the population is going to become more composed of a higher ratio of the medium phenotype. If the phenotype is a directional, if the natural selection force is directional, then it's going to cause a preference of one side of the spectrum to be better at surviving. And when that spectrum is phenotype is better at surviving, it's going to be able to produce offspring with its genotype and therefore hopefully its phenotype, and the population will slowly shift towards the characteristic that is better at surviving, because those that are better at surviving are producing the babies that have the same characteristics as them. There's also this interesting one called disruptive selection, where the phenotype range, only the extreme ends are actually the best at surviving, and the middle is the one that is getting caught and eaten all the time. And so, or dying or whatever, they're just not surviving and reproducing as well. And so the opposite ends of the spectrum are better at surviving, therefore they can reproduce and pass down their genes and their traits, and the offspring in the future tend to show peaks on those two extremes, with the middle dipping down, because that middle phenotype is not beneficial. In fact, it might even be harmful for survival. So I want you to take a look at this picture right here. We're talking birth weight in relation to percentages of birth and population, and also in comparison to percent of infant mortality. So infant mortality is in red, right? As you can see, it's a dip like this. And for percent births and population, you can see a jump like this. So what kind of natural selection is happening here? Is it going to be directional, disruptive, or stabilizing? Explain to me your thoughts. Just explain to me each of them individually, how they're related. For example, percent infant mortality, how it's related to birth weight. Explain what's happening on the lower end, the middle, and the high end, and then explain the percentage of births in a population in regards to birth weight. Explain what's common. Is it the low end, high end, or in the middle? And then based on these two affecting each other, you want to tell me, is this going to be a directional thing, a disruptive thing, or a stabilizing thing? Here we're going to look as well. This is actually recorded through history in fossils. You're looking at the ancestors of what we currently have as horses, and we're looking at a body size comparison. Initially, it was distributed around here, and then slowly moved towards here, and then now it's around this size. On the same chart, we're keeping them relative to each other. So what kind of natural selection is happening here? Is it directional, disruptive, or stabilizing? Explain to me, and explain how you know. Here we have another example. So there are two kinds of banding patterns on snail shells, and the initial distribution starts with the spectrum having a full, mainly intermediate population between these two, where it's kind of just this like has a stripe, but is kind of blended with the brown background. And slowly the banding pattern is shifting towards the two extremes to be fully banded and fully colored in. Is that going to be directional, disruptive, or stabilizing? And tell me why. Sexual selection is going to break one of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium conditions because adaptive changes in males and females lead to an increased ability to secure a mate. So basically, if females or males have a preference to their mate's physical appearance or strength or abilities, then there's going to be selection for a preference of which mate is going to be more popular, right? In a lot of populations that don't maintain monogamy, this is going to explode in producing different ratios in the next generation of alleles, because if a male is able to mate with many females, then a lot of offspring will have that male's characteristics, versus in a normal, for example, in a monogamous type of animal where they can only produce however many offspring the female can bear, but it's still that the males that are preferred will be able to secure the mate to begin with. So they're producing offspring. It's just not as explosive as a development as in a non-monogamous or polygamous kind of animal population. So males, if males have an increased ability to compete with other males for a mate, they're likely to be able to mate and produce offspring. And then if females get to choose the mate by their best fitness, they are going to be able to kind of alter what their offspring are looking like, or able to behave like, or able to grow into. So having sexual selection means that there's no random mating anymore. And when it's not random, then the allele frequencies are going to shift based on a specific preference. So a study of sexual selection among humans shows that female choice and male competition also apply to humans. And this is because women must invest more in having a child than a man, because they are the ones who are physically producing the child for 9 months. Men need to only contribute sperm technically for the baby to be produced. Obviously, this isn't taking into consideration anything after a baby is born. Men are generally more available for mating than are women. More available men results in competition. And then men also have a choice, because they can choose whether or not to, even if they compete for a woman, they can choose whether or not to follow through in the end. And then they prefer women who are more likely to present them with children. This is just because it's a natural animal instinct to want to produce offspring and pass your genes on to the next generation. So these were just from a study that actually explained that even though humans might be slightly different from animals for a lot of things, natural selection and Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium still does apply to humans, in that they also break the similar conditions that other animals break. So again, I want to go over that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium has these 5 conditions that need to be met in order for the population to be in equilibrium, aka there's no microevolution happening, right? Equilibrium means steady state. If any of these are broken, then microevolution occurs, and then allele frequencies are changing. So if you observe changes, you can say that there's evolution, and you can be able, it's kind of interesting to be able to observe that population where you know evolution has occurred, to see which reason that the evolution occurred in. So again, these 5 conditions are that there are no new mutations, there are no migrations happening, there are no sexual selection, so there's no preference. There's no natural selection, either by environment or by nature, and there is no genetic drift. So the population has to be large, right? No small populations. So these are good conditions to make sure that you definitely have written down. And let me explain what the Punnett square is at the bottom. So the Punnett square represents allele frequencies inside of a population. So the P represents one allele and the Q represents the other allele. So we usually talk like dominant and recessive. And so when you do a Punnett square with multiplication properties, you get this kind of quadratic based formula at the end. And this quadratic formula is what we use to apply to Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So if P represents one allele and Q represents the other allele, technically P plus Q equals 1. And that would be because the percentage of P's and the percentage of Q's added together equals 100% of the population. Now, this formula at the bottom here, where P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1, also holds valid when you have those ratios of P plus Q equals 1. So this is the formula that we actually use when we want to adjust for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and compare for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium if a population is in or is not. And we want to see if across different generations, if the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium still applies. We'll also use this quadratic formula to see, is it still equaling to 1? Is it still going to have P plus Q equals 1? Is it going to still have P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1 after one generation, after another generation? You can go all the way down to your F10 generation and see if it's changed or not. And if it's changed, that means that one of these 5 conditions was no longer met, and that that evolution has occurred.